Sure. Well, hi, Cassie, but also all the fellows of what sounds like a really exciting program. I'm Jee Kim. I founded and recently left the Narrative Initiative, which was a support organization to social movements, civil society organizations to help in their advocacy and social change efforts and using narratives techniques, narrative orientation to hopefully make change more durable, not just at the level of policy, but also at the level of kind of culture and norms and behaviors. And before that, I have a checkered history with a stint in media and technology, actually, in my first kind of days out of university, the dot-com boom, and then many years as a community activist, mostly working on immigrant rights and racial justice issues, and then most recently a stint in philanthropy as well. That's me in a nutshell.
Great, thank you. And a really relevant set of different experiences um, to the fellowship. So the first question that I had posed to you in advance, I won't pretend that we're going into like some kind of, you know, unplanned conversation, but I'd sort of asked, why is narrative so important in mobilizing collective action? And have you a favorite example as well that can kind of bring that to life?
Yeah, and thanks for sharing the question in advance because I think it's both straightforward but also quite tricky. I was thinking about some of my favorite narratives. Um, oh, I think narrative is critical because it taps people, I think, at a less superficial level, kind of under the surface, kind of into a deeper well of myths and stories that really animate our behavior, can often affect behavior change, and kind of give people more motivation to act, for instance. So on this side of the pond, we had quite a spectacle of a presidential debate last night, and I was thinking about the QAnon conspiracy, actually, and the way in which that is supporting and so vibrant and kind of infiltrating so many communities, and that community or subculture is actually animated by the same narrative that is the basis for um, many of the myths and stories that are super durable in our culture, like Star Wars. And that is the narrative of the underdog, the David and Goliath kind of narrative that the undersized, disadvantaged can, in the case of organizing, kind of collectively overcome these odds that we're in the face of. I think that narrative is quite dominant because it can kind of manifest in so many different ways. It can be the basis of a conspiracy theory, right? But it can also be the basis of Occupy Wall Street, essentially, which is the kind of ultimate 99, 1% David versus Goliath story, which brought so many people into motion and gave so many people a way of interpreting and understanding their lives, their livelihoods, what had happened to themselves and their communities. So the underdog narrative for me is one of my favorites. I think it's can cut in many different ways, but I think it also has a very long tradition in a progressive impulse to animate social change for the disadvantaged and disempowered in societies.
Great, thank you. My Wi-Fi was just a bit tricky there, so hopefully I think it was still really clear.
Okay.
Um, and then I'd sort of asked a question around, how, and maybe it sort of links, but how can narrative work be most effective in influencing change? I guess both at a local community level and at a policy level, because within the fellowship, there might be ways that people can build narratives that really shift things in their very local community, or in, you know, in the region of Greater Manchester, but also potentially at a national policy level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this one was pretty thought-provoking, and then I was thinking about Manchester, and I did my graduate work in the UK, so have a I think there's actually a phrase in psychology about having nostalgia for things that you have actually no direct experience of. Um, and Manchester holds that place in my imagination, just because of its kind of cultural significance, especially in music. So I think narratives are very important in the local context, in the community context, because it's an invitation to describe within a narrative structure what a protagonist is in your story. I am very much influenced and moved by, there's a psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, somewhat controversial, but he has done studies and surveys where he shows that progressives in the US, at least, or liberals in the US, are more drawn to, or have more affinity to, international identities than they do necessarily national or local ones. And I think that's really to the detriment of people who want to affect progressive social change, that we don't always contend for local levels of collective identity. We did a project at the Narrative Initiative, working in states in the US, since they are such important theaters of conflict and contestation, where we worked with civil society organizations to develop and advance state-based identities that kind of activated progressive values. In the US, there's a lot of kind of adherence or affinity and affiliation with kind of who you are as a Texan, or as a Californian, or as a New Yorker. And so it's a kind of sub-national level of identity, I think even just as true at the local level. But I think progressives, if I can make generalizations, would benefit by thinking about how do we activate local values, and in the service of kind of creating a protagonist for our story, and not necessarily go to the kind of global theater. So to one half of your question, Cassie, I think that's where the kind of narrative approach can be beneficial. And then when it comes to policy, I think it's increasingly acknowledged the way in which policy is not just a fight for kind of who has the best kind of charts and data, but rather how those things are told as a story, and how they reinforce one another through narratives. I think especially in the like the economics field, you know, on the US side, Robert Schiller has a new book about narrative economy, which is basically the storytelling involved in winning the kind of battle for economic policy. And then I've just reread Kate Rayworth's book on donut economics, which I found to be so helpful to think about the dominant narrative economic system and the policies that buttress it are really upheld and reinforced by a series of stories with a kind of overarching narrative frame and kind of predictable characters in a story. And so I think even when it comes to policy change, we have to think about not just presenting alternative policies, but also presenting alternative narratives so that those policies can have greater force than just the letters and the numbers on the page.
That's really helpful. I'm going to sneak in one additional question, and then come to the third one I asked you last. What do you? This is more about the technology rather than the narrative. But if you were to draw out some of the most dominant narratives you hear around technology at the moment that you think need rewriting? Could you just maybe give an example of one or two that you think within this program with the fellows you would like challenge us to think about or to address?
A narrative about technology itself.
Yeah, like a narrative about the relationship we have in our society with technology that
Yeah.
maybe need to like rethink, recreate.
Yeah. Oh boy, there's so much there, especially as kind of the social dilemma documentary on Netflix is hitting everyone's feeds, um, with a kind of knee-jerk impulse to delete all of your apps on your phone, which I think is a kind of knee-jerk impulse. Because I think technology actually at the level of narrative has become quite intertwined with certain economic paradigm narratives that have kind of served both sides of the equation. And the one that I would offer is the way in which technology has become kind of over-determined or inextricably associated with innovation. When we think about innovation, the automatic, association, I believe, especially for young people, but for anyone, is really with technology. And we can't imagine innovation being, disentangled. And I think that then becomes interwoven with the idea of an economic system that has to continue to grow. And when you read um, thinkers and op-ed pieces about growth and productivity and technology and innovation has driven the kind of most recent surge, and that's critical because we need productivity to keep growing and it has to be green if we're to survive. I think you see this kind of really tricky nexus where in particular technology and its association with innovation is not helping us. So I would say that that's one piece of the narrative on technology that I would want to challenge. I think the social dilemma does a good point of kind of putting a microscope on the idea of technology as a tool, which I think is also an important kind of piece of the narrative to trouble or to reimagine. Um, but but yeah, it's if there is one thing, I would offer that as an important piece to kind of interrogate.
That's really helpful, and especially as if we're thinking about how to mobilize, like how to build collective action in relation to tech policy in a city, for example. I guess so much of the kind of smart city narratives about technology and innovation are very entwined.
Mhm.
I think that's really helpful.
Mhm.
So the last question, a bit more of a practical one. What advice would you give to community groups and community leaders in terms of taking first steps in using narrative practice more effectively? So how should the fellows get more involved or more aware of different kind of practices they could start to draw on?
Yeah. Well, I think there are some kind of immediate tools at the narrative initiative. There was an emphasis on how these insights can be concretely translated into civil society organizations, social change campaigns, and things like the waves metaphor of kind of analyzing the issue that you're working on into different levels or depths of narrative, I think is really helpful. And then the kind of different capacities that you need in order to affect narrative change. That there are four kind of groupings of capacities. They're called the four baskets framework, all on the Narrative Initiative website, which kind of helps you then translate that into collective practice. There's also other ones, obviously a huge tradition, but there's a technique called, I think it's called causal layered analysis, which is in effect the same thing as the waves, in an attempt to kind of d- an analytical tool to identify the deeper narratives at play in what may be manifested on the surface. And I think the kind of the deeper a change effort can go, the better. I think it's about, kind of raising our ambition. But at the same time, I think it has to be paired with a real sober humility of what can be affected. And I always say that getting really clear about the scope, scale, and timeline of your project, your campaign, your organization will help kind of make realistic what your change efforts can achieve. The scope of the narrative change, if we go to the deepest narratives in climate on the relationship of human beings and the planet and nature, that will require a massive scale and an incredibly long period of time. So if you can identify scope, scale, and timeline, I think it helps bound or kind of structure the way in which you think and plan your narrative change work.
One of the things that I love most in terms of the tools at the Narrative Initiative is the one that talks about stars as stories, and then the kind of constellations and then galaxies. And I guess particularly the idea that each of our fellows might have some individual stories around the impacts of technology within their particular context, but then trying to weave those together into a constellation is one of the things I get most excited about in terms of the kind of collective action that then could happen from that.
Yeah. I think that it may be the kind of less appreciated value of narrative in the support work to organizations and campaigns that the Narrative Initiative embarked on. There were the external facing narratives in the world, but also there was really important work to be done on internal facing narratives and the way in which narrative can help what may be seemingly disparate or at least in tension efforts and organizations kind of cohere and hang together so that it can serve a kind of for the purposes of alignment. I think we talked a lot when I was at the organization about narrative as an alignment methodology to align efforts, to align long and short-term objectives and across sectors and organizations, which is a little bit undervalued, but just as impactful.